Hey guys, so I'm going to take a look at our contest winners from last year. So by now you should have already started your submission for the competition this month, and we have released three of the packs that we're going to release for the competition. So make sure you jump over and check out those packs. I'm going to have a look at our three grand prize submission winners from last year and have a look at why was it that they won, what were the things that they did right, what about the composition, the techniques, the overall image, and look at the reasons why, or the ways in which Satyaki and Mark, who got third and second place, how they could have improved their submissions to potentially beat Nitin's submission. So this should be a really interesting video for you guys to check out. So we're going to start with Nitin's submission, which got first place, and then we're going to step down from there and look at Satyaki's and how he could have improved it to compete with Nitin's. So the first thing about this image that really strikes you is that it's a very, very nice composition. Your eye will naturally sort of look at this main block of structure here and then fade off into the distance. And this is a trick with concept art, is leading the viewer's eye into the distance, because we typically love to look at things that are in the distance. It's a natural human tendency to want to see into the distance or to have some kind of openness. So that's something that naturally our eye starts sort of when I see this image, this section here really stands out because we've got a lot of we've got a bit of contrast through here, and then we start to notice this element, this major sort of centerpiece, and then starts to fade in down here, and the eye is drawn to all this contrast through here because it's indicating detail and interest, areas of interest. And naturally I want to be able to see, like, what is this down here, what's going on. There's a little bit of activity as well, and this is a really great sort of technique, is to add a little bit more interest. You add things like lights and smoke to indicate some life down in the distance. The birds in the foreground, they do add to the composition and the overall feel, but if we turn those off, the whole piece still stands. And that's something that you need to keep in mind, is if you're adding elements on like action sort of move elements like birds or animals or even characters in the foreground, that's not technically a matte painting process. We would be sort of going more towards concept art at that phase. It does help to bring a bit of life, and I do like these birds in here. But when we went to judge these images, the birds were kind of not really a major part of the criteria, because they weren't really the elements of matte painting. So through here, so we've got really nice integration of these elements. He's made sure that all his reflections through here, you can see this reflection of the boat. He's sort of matched a little bit of what might be going on with the water. There are some things that he's missed, like we don't have reflections of this grass in the water, or if we do, it's very, very subtle and not quite clear. But that's fine. There's a lot of elements in this image that are more concepty than, say, if you were working in a visual effects pipeline, these sorts of trees in the background here would probably be keyed out a lot nicer. But when it comes to a competition, we want to explore the ideas as fast as possible, and then come back and clean it up. And for that matter, at the final resolution, those trees in that background, they're not really noticeable. In fact, it would be this element in the foreground here, which we can clearly see has some crunchy edges to the branches and these leaves, and that would be something that I would definitely recommend fixing up, and potentially even this tree could have been improved. So he's added a lot of life to this image by adding lights as well. So these lights are really help to not only add life to the building to make it feel like there's people in there and there's activity, but he's also added them as reflections through here, which helps to give that feeling of sort of a glassy lake that really feels very serene and peaceful. So the last thing to note about this submission is the overall color grading is really nice. There's a really good color temperature to it. It's calming, it's wholesome, like every element sits in as a whole. There's nothing that sort of colors that don't match or temperatures that are conflicting. So let's go over to Satyaki's image. And this is where I can immediately comment on the color temperature of this piece. It's quite jarring. It's a very it's almost painterly in that sense, which is fine, and it could be what Satyaki was going for. But if we're going for a photorealistic environment, we would want to have this be a little bit more, a little bit cooler and more photoreal in that sense. So we can do that with the camera raw filter actually very quickly. So this is probably the biggest initial impression that is given that took it down a notch from Nitin's submission. If we just cool this down, or even if we go to auto temperature, okay, we'll go with that, and you can immediately see how that sort of relaxes the atmosphere. It's not quite as tense, like an environment that's this yellow, especially because the sun is quite high. So we have a high sun in the sky. So the amount of haze that's getting hit with that sunlight is not all that much compared to, say, if the sun was on the horizon, and that's why sunsets become more orange, because the light is going through more haze. So it wouldn't be going through much here unless, say, there was some epic fire happening and there was a lot of smoke in the atmosphere, and that's why a lot of these patches in the sky actually look more like smoke and less like clouds. The next thing I would say is the contrast in this image. My distance from here to there is not all that far. It's maybe a couple of 100 meters, because we can see the scale, like the scale of a human would probably be like this tall, maybe, yeah, around that, give or take. So the distance and the contrast values in the background here are a little bit too low. We need a bit more contrast in the overall image. So if we just pull down our blacks, so if we go too far, we're going to start to drop off this and really vignette this foreground. So what we can do is just lift our blacks in the foreground to start with, and then we'll drop these. Maybe that was too far. Just like 6, just to sort of pull this array away from full black. And we don't want to push this too high and start to clamp our values up here. We don't want anything to be, fully white, because then it really starts to kind of go the other way, and that this becomes way too intense and it's too fatiguing on the eyes. Okay, so that's feeling a little bit better. But the idea would be to work on this as you're going through the image, and make sure that you're just constantly relating it back to, okay, what would this actually feel like to physically be there? So looking at his technique, we can zoom in, and the first things I see when I initially saw this image was this sort of edge of this mountain. You can see it from here. There's two issues with this area, and that is the blue, which is very obvious, a very obvious issue. We just need to paint and fix that sort of color change. I'm not sure what's caused that. I'm not sure what's caused that. It's unlikely to have been in the original photography. But the other thing is also the edges of these mountains. So if we go back through, let's see if we can find his original. So yeah, so here you can actually see a little clearer that he's painted over this at some point. Yeah, So you can see that layer there that he's gone to patch it. So this is something that he just need to go through and take some time to actually do whatever he was trying to achieve there. So we can turn that off, and I'm trying to find the actual layer at this point to see if we can improve that edge. Yeah, so we can see this edge is very rough. It hasn't really been worked on. So if we went to, say, refine this mask, right? So we can do that with our refine tool, and we can come into here and we can just paint through these edges, and depending on what content is behind here, or in the original image, that is, we should get a better edge. But then we can always come through and manually sort of fix that area up. So it's just something that you need to take some time with. But the other issue with these mountains is that the sky isn't bright enough behind them. So if I was to grab the sky, and let's actually go back to here, and I'm going to grab the sky behind these mountains, and I'm going to brighten up. Let's just do it with an exposure. So I'm not going to worry about what's going on over here because I'm probably going to break some things. But if we just look in through here, by exposing the sky up, we're going to make the mountain feel like it's sitting in that location. So if I went the other way and we exposed it down, you can see that the mountain is lit too much relative to the sky. So that's the kind of thing that I'm explaining here, and we just want to make sure that the two elements are going to match together. So if we come back to my graded version, once I've fixed the color temperature, there are a couple of other things that we can start to look at. Like through here, we have some birds here that he's added as well, but there's a bit of a dustiness through here, which is fine. And this is a good trick to help to separate distances. Just be aware of where you use it, because the higher you go in altitude, typically the less dusty it becomes. So you can see over here on the right-hand side, he's also got the same kind of thing going on with a little bit of dust here. Now, this makes a lot more sense because we have a sun here that's potentially directly shining through and illuminating a cloud that's of dust that's been aggravated by maybe some animals or a wind, that kind of thing. So I've gone ahead and done some adjustments to this image really quickly to push a little bit further in the direction that I was suggesting. So we can see here is Satyaki's original image, and here's what I graded it to earlier, and then this is the final version. So I've just cooled down a little bit more of the sky compared to what we had before, brought in a bit more of the cool greens through the foreground as well, and added a few other sort of just really quick effects. So just to sort of give you an idea of where he could have gone from this submission, and if he had landed here, we would have had quite a bit of competition there for first place. So now moving on to Mark's image. This is where I was talking about in Satyaki's, where we need to be careful of how much we use haze and sort of overlays of light color. So the main areas that bug me in this image are this edge of this mountain, and then the amount of contrast drop off that we have into the background. The reason this edge is bugging me is that there's no context as to why the edge of this mountain is getting suddenly brighter compared to what is in the foreground. We're not going back enough in distance to lose that amount of contrast, and there's no cloud here or massive dusty plume that is contributing to that brightness. I don't mind these shafts of light. I actually think that they really work quite well. But as a thumbnail, like if we really zoom out, we have a patch of darkness here on the left, and then we've got this sort of shaft of light
and then again like weird sort of patches of different shades into the background. Now, if we compare that to Nitten's image, we can very clearly see the stages of the atmosphere building up, the contrast dropping off into the distance. Even as a tiny zoomed out image, we can tell what it is, and two, it still holds together as a composition. And with Satyaki's, if we zoom out, you can see that it still holds its composition. It's got a little bit of flow. We've got sort of framing through here, and our eye is led down here. But it's not quite as successful as Nitten's in terms of that composition. Now, if Satyaki had played to that human psychology of wanting to see into the distance, he could have removed this mountain and had the eye lead sort of down this valley, and we could have even had the sun down here to then get more of that sort of twilight hour. So back to Mark's image. So that edge is a problem, obviously. We also have some edge issues just in general. And then we have a couple of color discrepancies here, which you could argue that this is a mountain coming in front of the background, but there's got to be a transition zone of some sort. And then the foreground elements. One issue with these foreground elements is that they are clearly daylight elements that have been dropped in brightness. And to be clear, this isn't necessarily an easy thing to make look realistic. It's just something that you need to be aware of, is that just darkening a daytime photo of brightly lit elements is not going to do quite enough to make it look like it's in shadow. So we have the typical sort of issues with some layers through here, which you might not notice it at first, but when we're judging these images, we have to look at these sorts of things and consider, okay, how well are the images graded? How well are they cut out? How does the composition work? Does it look photorealistic? Those sorts of things. So as we go down through the valley, he's done a pretty good job of leading the eye down here into this sort of, like, I want to walk down there and see what's around this corner. But the problem is that there's not really that much interest through here. The image is more like it's a very tight window, and I guess in that sense, it's even further removed from Satyaki's and Nitten's in terms of that composition leading the eye into the distance. And that's not to say that you can't win a competition with a composition like this. It's just a lot more difficult because you have to have some kind of interest in the foreground to draw the eye there. Otherwise, the eye sort of roams around the page. I think for me, the first thing I notice about this image is these two diagonals. And that's because they're the areas of most contrast. And so they both sort of lead the eye into here, which then we have a little bit of this interest of the river, but it's not really enough to make me want to sort of look at this image for very long. Other than that, this image probably has the same or similar issues to Satyaki's in terms of contrast. Now, again, I'm doing this on a flattened layer, so it's not quite the same as doing it as you go, because we would really want to remove some of the fog and lack of contrast in the background elements. So what Mark's image does really exceptionally well is the scale indication. So here we have these massive elements that are continuing up out of the frame, and it's just natural for our minds to think, how big are they? Where do they end? What is up there, and what does it look like? And this is a really interesting technique that you should pay attention to. Guys like Raphael Lacoste, Julien Calais, the concept artists out there, they use these kind of elements continuing out of the frame, one, to frame the composition, and two, to indicate that epic grand scale. So if we go over to Satyaki's image, we have the the scale indicator of this mountain in the background, and then we have our foreground sort of contrast element that gives us an idea of how far back that mountain might be. And in Nitin's submission, the scale element is this monastery on the hill. So the most successful in this respect is definitely Mark's image in terms of conveying this epic scale. It's not something that you need to do, but it's definitely something that you should think of as really tightening that composition, having some elements flying out of the frame, because it'll really help with the general feel of the image. So hopefully by seeing these competition winners from last year, it'll give you a lot of ideas on how you can improve your submission and also avoid the kinds of mistakes that we see a lot of the time. Just remember to use the forum or Discord channels or even the Facebook community group to ask for feedback from the community, because there are a lot of artists out there who have a lot of really good feedback and really good comments.